Look at these vast American territories: California, Texas, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, New Mexico. Altogether, 8 large, and today also wealthy states, where almost a third of the US population lives. But 200 years ago, all these lands belonged to another country, Mexico. Why did they give them away? Because they would lose a war, initiated by US President James Knox Polk. At his inauguration, he declared vital goals for the American nation to acquire new lands in the west of the continent, including annexing both Texas and California. In less than 2 years of war, the states would take half of all Mexican lands and definitively suppress a dangerous competitor on the continent. As a result, some become a global superpower, while others work for them. And today, Mexicans are one of the hardest working and happiest nations on the planet. The country confidently ranks among the top 20 largest economies in the world, 13th in size and 10th in population. With vast natural resources and an excellent geographical location between 2 oceans and next to a wealthy neighbor. But despite these circumstances, why does Mexico remain one of the most dangerous, corrupt, and problematic countries? We will definitely talk about this and much more in this video. Like, subscribe to the channel, and let's continue. This is 3,155 kilometers of the American-Mexican border, and it is here that the unique city of Nogales stands. One part of it is in the USA, the other in Mexico. Shared roots, one culture, one climate. Essentially, the same people. But statistically, they are 2 different worlds separated by a rusty iron fence. Compare, in 2021, the Mexican part of Nogales registered a whopping 365 homicides. One could say, they consistently kill 1 person a day here. How many homicides in the American part? None. The average family income in Mexico is $14,000 per year. But on the American side of the fence, a similar family lives on almost $32,000 on average. 2/3 of the residents of the American Nogales have higher education, while in the Mexican part, only 1/3 do. So what's the reason for such a noticeable difference when essentially talking about the same city? In the book Why Nations Fail, the authors explain this by different approaches to how societies are governed. Essentially, throughout history, there have been 2 types of states. Some create rules of the game to allow as many new people as possible to emerge who can manage the society. They compete among themselves. The most successful ones enrich themselves freely and transparently, and most importantly, they are not afraid to lose their wealth because there is a stable law that will protect them. And if new wealthy people emerge, it's not because they robbed the previous ones, but because someone ingeniously comes up with something new and useful for society. And countries with such an approach have always succeeded in different historical periods. Then there's the second type of state. There, all the rules of the game are like in The Lord of the Mountain. Whoever gets to the top first burns everyone else. And quickly, they rewrite the rules of the game to protect themselves and extract as many resources as possible from the mountain and its inhabitants. So in the first case, the state ensures that people, like ants, constantly work and contribute to the common pie, making it bigger. While in the second case, no one extra is allowed near that pie, and the juiciest pieces are kept for themselves. Let's test this theory on Mexico. Look at this man. His name is Carlos Slim. If anyone missed it, this Mexican has been considered the richest person not just in the country but on the planet for 4 consecutive years. At that time, he even outstripped the richest Americans like Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and all the others. At that time, his personal fortune was estimated at 5.8% of all goods and services in Mexico. Again, in a country where already 112 million people lived at that time, only one of them controlled some astronomical wealth. Where else have you seen this? Someone might say, look at today's richest Frenchman, Bernard Arnault. His wealth also accounts for a whopping 7% of French GDP. Yes, but the difference is that the Arnault family owns dozens of global brands that are sold and compete with other such brands worldwide. So what's the difference between the Frenchman Arnault and the Mexican Slim? The latter makes his billions on monopolies. What does this mean? At some point, his mobile communication company Telmex controlled 92% of all wired telecommunications in the country. And his company America Mobile, you probably haven't heard of it either. It captures 2/3 of mobile communications in Mexico and the rest of Latin America. What does Carlos Slim's success say? On the one hand, that in Mexico, there are huge opportunities, there are people to work and people to sell to. Today, 129 million people already live there, and by 2050, according to Mexican forecasts, it will be even more, up to 160 million. Another important point, the country has very low salaries, but at the same time, Mexicans are perhaps the hardest working nation on the planet. They toil even more than workaholic Koreans. Add these 2 thoughts together, and we understand that Mexico is perfectly suited for cheap production of anything. For example, the same applies to cars. All the major brands have already opened their factories there. In fact, as many cars are now assembled in Mexico as in Germany or South Korea. But here's the important detail: most of the Mexican auto assembly doesn't stay in Mexico itself. Where does it go? That's right, north, to the United States. And you probably know that millions of ordinary Mexicans want to use the same route from Mexico to the USA. According to official data, there are already 37 million Mexicans in the USA. But pay attention to where they are most concentrated, on the very territories that the USA detached from Mexico in the mid-19th century. But when Americans annex them, they choose the least populated lands. Why? To later populate them themselves and to minimize problems with the existing population. But the irony is that everything the states will take in the 21st century will end up being half occupied by the same Mexicans and their descendants. Appreciate the scale. In 2022, Mexican immigrants from the USA will send $58.5 billion back home to Mexico. But even more interesting is another comparison. Look at what Mexico earns the most from today: passenger cars, trucks, and parts, oil, computer manufacturing. Any of these revenue items is less than the money Mexicans send home. And now, consider who the main and essentially the only buyer of Mexican goods is: the USA. In fact, for the USA, Mexico is a cheap factory for everything in the world and a stash of free labor for a rainy day. In 1942, in the midst of World War II, America sent millions of its men to fight in Europe and other parts of the world. But at the same time, the states continued to supply more weapons and products to the Allies than anyone else. Where did they get their workers from? In that same 1942, the American government signed an agreement with its neighbor. According to it, from 2 to 5 million Mexican migrants would go to work in American fields and factories, maintain railways, in short, contribute to the glory of the world's leading economy. And when the war ends and American soldiers start returning to their jobs, the state organizes another operation, Wetback. And what's that? Over 5 years, the USA deport around 5 million Mexicans back to their homeland. But those are just official figures. In reality, as you can guess, American businesses will draw Latin Americans for cheap labor so tightly that they'll hire them illegally because you don't owe any social guarantees to such fellows. You can pay them at best half of the minimum wage. And then, you take the remaining money for yourself and don't forget to bribe the state inspectors. So by the 1950s, illegal immigrants will be crossing the border with the states by the millions annually. But today, there are more and more of them. In 2022, American border guards reported that they stopped 2,766,000 illegal immigrants from the Mexican side. No one will say how many people will ultimately cross the border. But globally, people are not stopped by fences, thermal cameras, or checkpoints. Why do they flee to America when in Mexico there's more and more economic growth, high-tech manufacturing from the world's most famous companies? And remember how often people are killed in Mexican and American streets. Now, let's take a look at what's happening across the country as a whole. Mexico is one of the world leaders in terms of the number of homicides. But what's even more frightening is that violence in the country has sharply increased recently. Today, they are experiencing classic Russian 90s indicators. Why? Because they are having their own 90s, and the power in Mexican society is seized by warring drug cartels. For example, in 2019, a sitting American senator calculated how much money Mexicans earn from drugs in the USA. Most likely, of course, the politician got the zeros wrong, because different sources estimate this amount to be about 10 times smaller, at a maximum of $50 billion. But you understand that this is on the level of how much Mexico sells oil and so on down the list. You can't verify the exact sum, but two things are absolutely obvious. Firstly, the USA is the biggest consumer of drugs in the world, and consequently, they are being sent there in massive quantities. And secondly, what's the easiest way to smuggle them there? That's right, through the Mexican border. If previously Mexico lived more as a mediator, with guys like Escobar transporting Colombian cocaine to California through it, today, when there's a global boom in synthetic drugs, Mexicans themselves have become major producers. When it comes to cocaine or heroin, you need large plantations, you need to watch over the crop, guard it, set up some serious production, but when it comes to synthetics, it's simpler. You take these Mexican mini-cooks, give them Chinese chemicals, clear instructions with the quantities of ingredients, pay them $100 a day instead of the $20 they could earn from some plantation at home, and in a day, you've got kilograms of goods worth millions of dollars. What do cartels have to do with it? They are the ones organizing such productions all over the country, logistics, security, now not just for drug trafficking. And imagine what happens in society when tens of thousands of such armed squads emerge there, armed no worse than a regular army. The natural question is, why should they fear the authorities when they have their own army, their stable incomes, and the cartels continue to expand, blatantly steal, for example, oil, and sell it personally to the states? Or they even subjugate the export of such a harmless product as avocados to themselves. Yes, Mexico grows more of this trendy fruit than anyone else on the planet. They even call it green gold there. But if previously cartels simply extorted businesses, now they are massively seizing crops, or simply kicking out or killing peasants and starting to grow themselves. And the turnovers there are juicy, up to $3 billion a year. And in such a ruleless competition, sky-high murder rates are born. And here's the logical question: why can't the state cope with this crime spree? Because the state isn't made up of Martians who were landed to govern the country. Officials are just ordinary mortals, who grow up in a corrupt system, feed off it, and are tied to it. Meet former Mexican President Fox Quesada Vicente. He leads the country for 6 years. This is the maximum term allowed by law and, by the way, without the right of re-election. It seems like everything's fine. During this time, the economy will grow by 12%. The indicators of those same homicides will be at historical lows. But look what will happen to Coca-Cola consumption. In 1990, 280 bottles per person per year were drunk in Mexico. In 2000, 456, and in 2010, already 675. What does Mexico's economy have to do with some Coca-Cola and its president? Judge for yourself. Before becoming head of state, he spent 15 years building a career at that very Coca-Cola and rose to head of the entire company network in Latin America. Clearly, this is by no means direct evidence that the president, you see, worked at Coca-Cola and they gave money for his political career, and therefore the company's sales later increased. But look at what happens to the country in the last decade. Mexico becomes the world's largest consumer of sweet soda. They now drink even more of it than in the States. And, roughly speaking, the average Mexican pours 2 small bottles into himself every day. Coke is so popular that even local shamans include it in their rituals. So, what's the result of this cola cult? Since 2000, the number of people with diabetes in Mexico has doubled, and every 7th death today is from it. Over the same period, the number of children suffering from obesity will increase by 40%. And a total of 94 million Mexicans are already overweight. In no other country in the world do sweet drinks kill as many people as in Mexico. Pandemic and risk. But it's understandable. Notice how much Coca-Cola has been investing in the country in recent years? Roughly the same amount as in a whole African continent. What's the point of this story? Starting from that very President Vicente Fox, Coca-Cola conquers 60% of the Mexican market, but the main company decides to tackle one of the most complex problems in the country for itself: access to drinking water. The thing is, soda factories require a ton of water. Where do they get it? From local rivers and lakes, thereby taking it away from the indigenous population. Just so you understand, even the capital, Mexico City, sinks into the ground by 40 centimeters every year. Why? Because the city is built on the ancient bed of a lake, and to supply water for a 20 million megacity, they pump it out from beneath themselves. And now imagine what it's like to live in some province where there might not even be running water at all. And if it does exist, the water quality there is at the bottom. But Coca-Cola guarantees that its drinks are made from pure water and meet all international standards. And what will people choose to drink, and what will they buy for their children? In reality, Mexico is yet another vivid example of how unlimited commercial interests shape society and its inhabitants. You, transnational corporations, want to open new profitable productions? Welcome. You, wealthy neighbor, are seeking cheap labor? Feel free to use it. You need the perfect geographical location to freely traffic banned substances around the world? Just don't forget to share. But who benefits from all this? Transnational companies, wealthy neighbors, drug cartels. Of course, politicians who cover all this up? And what's left for the rest? Poverty, crime, and such a mortality rate. So why don't the states, which are fighting for freedom, democracy, and security around the world, support their neighbor? An interesting detail: when in the 19th century the USA decided to seize Mexican lands, a prominent general and future military governor of California will say the following about Mexico: the great difference in race, language, religion, and government between the United States and Mexico makes close political connection between them impossible. Or here's another major politician of that era, Vice President Calhoun: we never dreamed of incorporating into our union any but the Caucasian race, the free white race. Should we treat as equals the Indians and mestizos of Mexico? Then why do we need such high, long fences? Any argument about the chosenness of one nation and the backwardness of another is, at the very least, for those guys of the 19th century. But in fact, the modern world has not gone far. It's easier to build fences, curtains, and live by the principle of what's mine is mine, and what's yours is subject to discussion. And it seems we're entering an era where such fences will become more and more common. Is this a solution? If the content has engaged you, don't forget to react to it and share it with friends and those who want to support me and my team. Like, subscribe to the channel, and see you soon.